My sister added me to a private family chat by accident 10 days before Christmas. 47 messages were waiting. At first, they were arguing about food, gifts, and who would sleep in which room of my grandparents' penthouse. Then I saw Dad's message. "Make sure she doesn't find out." My brother answered, "Just tell her the wrong date, say the 25th. They were planning Christmas Eve without me, in the very home I had just learned was legally mine. I didn't confront anyone. I took screenshots and arranged for every old key and building permission to be useless before Christmas Eve. Stay with me, because those 47 messages changed what I thought I knew about my family. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe and keep listening. The call that started everything came while I was at my desk reviewing an installation schedule for a museum exhibit due to open in January. I almost let it go to voicemail. The number belonged to the attorney who had handled parts of my grandmother Evelyn's estate planning, and since Grandma had died in November, every call connected to her seemed to carry some practical task I was not ready for. Instead, the attorney explained, in plain language, that the professional successor trustee had completed the distribution of one specific asset from Grandma's trust and recorded the transfer. The Boston penthouse now belonged to me. I stopped taking notes. My pen remained pressed against the same line until the ink bled into a dark spot. There was more estate work still being handled. No one suggested everything had somehow been settled in a few weeks. But this part was complete. The penthouse had been directed to Natalie Whitmore. My name, not my father's. That was the part I could not make fit. For as long as I could remember, everyone had assumed the place would eventually go to Dad. No one had announced it formally. Grandma and Grandpa had never held a family meeting about inheritance, at least not one I knew about. It was simply an expectation that hardened through repetition until it stopped sounding like an assumption. Dad was their only son. He had taken over most holiday planning after Grandpa George died. When relatives talked about the future of the penthouse, they spoke around Dad as though the property were already waiting for him. I ended the call with fewer questions than I probably should have asked, not because I understood everything, but because I understood the only fact that mattered that morning. The place my family had treated as belonging to everyone had been left, legally and specifically, to me. Outside the office windows, Boston had the flat, silver light it gets before snow. Somewhere down the hall, someone was testing an audio track for an exhibit, a low loop of voices and music that kept restarting. The ordinary noise made the news feel stranger. I had been 19 when Grandma and Grandpa bought the penthouse. They had not bought it as a private trophy. Grandpa liked the view, but Grandma cared more about the dining room and the number of bedrooms. She wanted a place where people could stay without counting hotel nights, and where a holiday dinner did not require folding tables pushed into 3 rooms. Over the years, the penthouse absorbed our family almost by accident. Christmas mornings with children in pajamas, cousins sleeping on couches after graduation parties, aunts arriving from out of state with suitcases, birthday cakes cooling on the kitchen counter while people argued about candles. As each of us became adults, we got keys. At first, everyone called it Grandma and Grandpa's place. Later, it became the penthouse. Eventually, even that sounded too formal. Somewhere along the way, we started calling it the family place, and the phrase did something none of us noticed. It blurred the difference between being welcomed and having a right to enter. I had my own condo outside central Boston, smaller and quieter, close enough to work that I never needed the penthouse except for family gatherings. Colin used his key more often because he lived nearby. Tessa sometimes stayed there after late events downtown. Dad and Mom treated the place almost as an extension of their own home, especially after Grandpa died. That history was exactly why my first reaction was not to take anything away. By lunchtime, I had decided I would tell everyone on Christmas Eve. We had always gathered at the penthouse, and I wanted the announcement to happen there, face to face. I imagined Dad being shocked. Colin would probably ask practical questions. Tessa would worry about whether anything had to change. Mom would look around the room as if the walls themselves needed reassurance. I planned to give it. The penthouse could remain the family place. People could still gather there. Relatives could still stay when they came to Boston. I had no interest in turning Grandma's home into a private monument to myself. The only thing I wanted to change was something I had begun wanting long before I knew I would inherit anything. People needed to ask before making decisions that belonged to someone else. That thought brought back the strain I had been trying not to carry into Christmas. The last years of Grandma's life had changed the way Dad and I spoke to each other. After Grandpa died, Dad became more protective of her, then more certain. He worried about the size of the penthouse, about her being alone, about what might happen if the elevator failed or she fell or needed help. None of those fears were imaginary. The problem was that Dad often moved from worrying about what Grandma might need to deciding what she should do before she had answered for herself. I kept insisting that we ask her first. He began hearing the word choice as criticism. I began hearing every plan he made as pressure. Colin got caught in the practical middle because he lived closest. Tessa kept trying to soften conversations after they went bad. Mom usually wanted whichever solution would end the argument fastest. By the time Grandma eventually made her own decisions about where she wanted to live, none of us were talking about those years cleanly anymore. I knew Colin carried resentment toward me. I knew Dad believed I had made an already difficult period harder. I knew Tessa had grown tired of being the bridge between people who refused to cross the distance themselves. What I did not know was whether any of us still wanted to repair it. Grandma's death made that question feel urgent. Christmas would be the first major family gathering without her. I told myself the penthouse announcement could be a beginning rather than another fracture. For once, I would not wait for everyone to infer what I meant. I would say clearly that nothing had to be lost, simply because ownership had changed. That was still my plan 3 days later, when my phone vibrated while I was eating dinner at my kitchen counter. A messenger notification appeared from Tessa. She had added me to a group called Christmas Eve Final Plan. I stared at the title for a second, mildly annoyed that someone had apparently created yet another family thread. I opened it, expecting a question about food or timing. At the top of the screen, beneath the member names, I saw 47 earlier messages. My thumb stopped. This was not a new chat. I had been added to a conversation that had been going on without me. For a few seconds, I assumed Tessa had simply forgotten me when she created it. It would have been like her to notice late, add me quietly, and hope nobody made the oversight into a problem. Then I scrolled upward. The messages were dated days before I had been added. I caught fragments, first Colin's name, Mom discussing food, Dad confirming a time. I kept moving backward until my own name appeared in a message I had never been meant to see. I read the line once. Then again, Dad had written, "Make sure she doesn't find out." For several seconds, I did nothing. My thumb hovered over the screen while the refrigerator hummed behind me and the food on my plate cooled untouched. The message was far enough up the thread that I could see only pieces of the conversation around it, and some stubborn part of me still searched for an explanation that would make the sentence less deliberate. Maybe they were talking about a gift. Maybe something had been planned as a surprise. Maybe my name had appeared for a reason that had nothing to do with the tightness spreading across my chest. I scrolled farther back instead of guessing. The first messages were so ordinary, they almost made me feel foolish for being alarmed. Colin had asked whether he should pick up wine near his house or wait until he reached downtown. Mom had volunteered to bring 2 side dishes. Tessa had been trying to work out sleeping arrangements because Colin's children, 10 and 7, wanted the same guest room they had used the year before. Someone mentioned dessert. Dad reminded everyone that the building tended to get busy around holiday arrivals and suggested getting there early. It looked exactly like every Christmas planning conversation my family had ever had, except I had never been part of it. The date at the top of the oldest messages told me they had started organizing days before Tessa added me. No one had forgotten to include me in a thread created an hour ago. They had built the entire plan without me, adding details one by one until my absence became as normal as deciding who would bring pie. Then I reached the exchange that removed the last possible innocent explanation. Tessa had asked whether I knew everyone was gathering on December 24th. Dad's answer was the line that had already stopped me. A few messages later, Colin replied, "Just tell her the wrong date, say the 25th. I read those words more slowly than the others. Colin had not written them in anger after a fight. There was no argument above them, no burst of temper, no late-night accusation anyone could later claim had been typed before someone cooled down. The suggestion sat between a question about groceries and a discussion about what time the children would arrive. That calmness hurt more than shouting would have. There was a short pause in the thread after Colin's message. Tessa wrote that lying about the date seemed unnecessary. She did not push harder. Dad answered that he wanted one Christmas where nobody had to reopen everything about Grandma. One evening where people did not have to spend the night walking on eggshells. Mom did not object. She shifted the conversation toward dinner, and Tessa eventually did the same. That was how the decision became real. Not because everyone celebrated it, but because enough people kept planning after they knew what it meant. I set the phone down and pressed both palms against the edge of the counter. The stone felt cold beneath my skin. For years I had been called difficult, whenever I refused to let a family decision become unanimous, simply because Dad had said it loudly enough. I had learned to recognize the tired look Mom gave me when she wanted me to stop pushing. I had watched Tessa move conversations away from anything uncomfortable. I had heard Colin accuse me of caring more about principles than the people who had to live with them. But I had never imagined them sitting together, even digitally, deciding that peace required deceiving me. When I picked the phone up again, I forced myself to keep reading. That was when the humiliation changed shape. They were not simply planning a Christmas somewhere else. They were planning it at the penthouse. Colin had already claimed one of the guest rooms for his children. Mom wanted to know whether Grandma's large roasting pan was still in the lower pantry cabinet. Tessa suggested using the blue and white serving dishes because Grandma had always brought those out at Christmas. Dad said he would arrive early and open up before the others got there. Open up. The phrase stopped me. Every person in that conversation still had an old key. They were talking about arrival times, rooms, food, dishes, and access with the relaxed certainty of people who did not believe anyone needed to grant permission. Nobody had asked whoever now owned the apartment whether 24th worked. Nobody knew that person was me, but that almost made the assumption worse. As far as they were concerned, Grandma was gone. The property had not yet become anyone else's concern, and their habits were enough. They had decided I should not be part of Christmas. They had also decided my grandparents' home should still be. 3 days earlier, I had been sitting at my desk wondering how to reassure them that nothing had to change. I had been preparing to tell Dad that he would not lose the place where he had spent nearly 20 years celebrating holidays. I had been thinking about Colin's children and the guest room they loved, about Tessa staying downtown after events, about relatives coming from out of state. I had worried that ownership itself would frighten everyone. So I had already been planning how to make it clear that the penthouse could remain what Grandma intended. They were planning how to use it without me, while I was planning how to keep it available to them. My phone was already in my hand when I opened Dad's contact. I could see the conversation before it happened. I would tell him I had seen the group. He would ask why I was reading messages that had not been meant for me, even though I had been added to them. I would demand an explanation. He would say the family needed one peaceful Christmas after Grandma's death. Colin would hear about the call. Tessa would panic. Within an hour, someone would suggest moving dinner to Dad and Mom's house. Then the story would change. By Christmas, the problem would no longer be that they had deliberately lied to me. The problem would be that I had discovered the plan and created drama. I had spent too much of my life walking directly into that transformation. I closed Dad's contact without calling. Then I took screenshots. I did not collect them because I imagined a courtroom or a legal fight. Nothing in that chat was a crime. I saved them because I knew what happened to difficult family memories once everyone had time to soften them. A deliberate lie became a misunderstanding. Silence became uncertainty. Cruelty became stress. 6 months later, Someone would remember that nobody had actually wanted to exclude me. They had merely believed I was busy. I wanted one record that did not depend on anyone's memory, including mine. After that, I did something that felt almost unnaturally quiet. I went back to work. For the next day, I made no announcement and asked no questions. The family chat continued. Every new notification told me they still believed nothing had changed. Colin confirmed what time he would pick up the wine. Mom added another dish. Dad reminded everyone that he planned to get there first. Meanwhile, I contacted the penthouse property manager. The conversation was much less dramatic than the one my family would probably have imagined. I confirmed the recorded ownership transfer they already had on file and asked what was required to end the standing building permissions that had accumulated under Grandma's ownership. The old access arrangements had been informal conveniences for relatives, not leases or residency rights. I asked that those authorizations be removed. I also arranged for an ordinary locksmith to rekey the unit. Nothing happened instantly. There was paperwork to confirm, a schedule to coordinate, and several days between my decision and the work being completed. I did not need to stand over anyone while it happened. I did not need a speech about property rights. By the time everything was arranged, the process felt almost boring compared with the reason I was doing it. That made it harder in an unexpected way. Those old keys had never frightened me. For most of my adult life, hearing one turn in the penthouse door meant somebody had arrived early. A cousin had come in from the airport, Colin had brought his children upstairs, or Dad had beaten the rest of us there to start coffee. I was not changing the locks because I suddenly wanted an empty apartment. I was changing them because welcome had somehow become something nobody thought they needed to ask for. The messenger thread kept moving while the days narrowed toward Christmas Eve. I stayed inside it and said nothing. At first I wondered whether Tessa knew I was there. Then, 2 days before Christmas, a private message appeared from her. She had finally noticed. Her message was short and panicked. She said she had added me by mistake and asked me not to react before she could explain. I read it once, then locked my phone. She had been in the group when Dad told them to hide Christmas from me. She had watched Colin suggest the wrong date. Whatever explanation she wanted to give me could wait until after I decided what I was willing to hear. Later that afternoon, I went to the penthouse. The rooms were quiet, washed in pale winter light. The long dining table stood where it always had. The kitchen still looked ready for the family Christmas everyone believed would happen there. I walked through the space without touching much, past the guest rooms they had already assigned to themselves, and the pantry they had discussed, as though the door would open simply because it always had. At the front entrance, I tested the new lock once. Then again, the mechanism turned smoothly beneath my hand. I stepped into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind me. The new lock clicked into place. For the first time since reading those 47 messages, I stopped wondering what I should say to my family. The next move belonged to them. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of cold that made every window in my condo feel thinner than usual. By late afternoon, the sky over Boston had already begun fading toward blue-gray, and the lights from neighboring buildings looked warmer than they really were. I had spent most of the day doing ordinary things on purpose. Laundry, answering work emails I could have ignored, reheating soup I barely tasted. Every few hours, my phone lit up with another message from the secret Christmas thread. Arrival times. Food. A reminder from Dad that he planned to get to the penthouse first. No one had changed anything because no one knew anything had changed. I did not go to the penthouse. I had no interest in standing behind the door, waiting to watch my family discover what I had done. The thought felt too theatrical. Too close to the kind of public confrontation I had spent years avoiding. Whatever happened when their old permissions failed, I wanted it to happen because they had assumed access, not because I was waiting there to humiliate them. The call came a little after 5. I recognized the building number and felt my shoulders tighten before I answered. The concierge kept the conversation factual. Several members of the Whitmore family had arrived, carrying food, gifts, and overnight bags. They said they had always had access to the residence, but their building permissions were no longer active. Their old unit keys were not working either. The staff had checked the current ownership information and was calling because I was now the person authorized to admit guests. The question was simple. Did I want them sent upstairs? For a moment, I looked toward the dark reflection of my kitchen window. My face hovered faintly over the lights outside. 10 days earlier, I had planned to spend that evening with all of them. I had imagined standing in Grandma's dining room and telling them the penthouse was mine while making it clear they were not losing the place. Now they were downstairs because they had tried to celebrate Christmas there without telling me Christmas was happening. I told the concierge I was not authorizing entry. Nothing more. I did not ask anyone to make them wait. I did not ask for security. I did not ask the staff to repeat some humiliating message about ownership. I simply declined to let people into a property they had never asked to use. My phone started vibrating less than a minute after the call ended. Tessa was first. Her private message said they were in the lobby and their access was gone. Before I could even finish reading it, Colin wrote in the Christmas thread, demanding to know what I had done to the keys. Mom followed with a message about the children standing downstairs with coats, presents, and food, asking me not to make the situation worse. Dad called. I let it ring until it stopped. Then he called again. And again. The screen went dark between calls for only a few seconds at a time. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone beside my hand, listening to the vibration rattle softly against the wood. A week earlier, I might have answered on the second call out of sheer reflex. Dad had spent most of my life teaching the family that urgency belonged to whoever spoke with the most certainty. If he called 3 times, whatever boundary I had been considering suddenly felt less important than resolving his problem. This time, the problem was the boundary. Another message appeared from Colin. The old keys were useless. He wanted an explanation immediately. I opened the same group thread, where he had told everyone to give me the wrong date. The older messages were still there beneath the new ones. Dad's instruction, Colin's suggestion, Tessa's weak objection, Mom's silence. Then the days of cheerful planning afterward. I did not need to explain anything yet. I typed one sentence. Merry Christmas. Looks like you got the wrong date. I sent it. For several seconds, nobody replied. That silence was the closest thing to satisfaction I felt all evening. Then the messages began again. Colin accused me of being vindictive. Mom asked whether I understood that the children had been expecting Christmas at the penthouse. Tessa did not defend me, but her messages shifted toward practicality, trying to get everyone moving rather than letting the lobby become another battleground. Dad stopped writing entirely and returned to calling. I still did not answer. The fact that the children were there mattered to me. They had done nothing wrong. That was exactly why I had not wanted anyone stranded on a sidewalk or caught inside some confrontation between adults. Within minutes, the messages made clear that the family was abandoning the penthouse plan and moving Christmas to Dad and Mom's house. Colin complained about having to repack the food. Tessa started coordinating who would drive with whom. Mom mentioned finding space for the children. The crisis became inconvenient instead of dangerous. That was enough. I put my phone on silent and left it face down for the next hour. The strangest part was how quiet my own condo remained. Somewhere across the courtyard, someone had music playing. I could smell something buttery from another apartment whenever the heat kicked on. The normal Christmas Eve sounds only sharpened the fact that my family was now gathering 30 or 40 minutes away, angry at me, inside a house where they had been forced to relocate because they had counted on a home they did not own. When I finally turned the phone over again, Dad had left no voicemail, just 7 missed calls. The 8th came while I was looking at the screen. This time I answered. His voice was controlled in the way it became when anger had moved past shouting and settled into judgment. He accused me of locking the family out of his mother's home on Christmas Eve. He did not ask why. He did not mention the secret group chat. He spoke as though the only meaningful event of the evening was my response to what they had already done. I let him finish. Then I told him the simplest truth I had. No one asked whether you could use it. There was a pause, short but unmistakable. Dad said no one had ever needed to ask. The penthouse had always been the family place. Grandma and Grandpa had built that tradition themselves. People had keys because they were supposed to have keys. The phrase family place landed differently. Now that I knew what the paperwork said, I had heard it for years as warmth. Dad was using it as authority. I told him that traditions did not erase ownership. He demanded to know what I meant. I could have waited. I could have saved the inheritance announcement for another day when everyone was less angry. That had been my instinct for most of my life. Wait until the room was calmer, until Dad was less defensive, until Mom was less worried, until Colin was less exhausted. There was always another reason not to say something yet. So I said it. Grandma left the penthouse to me. The transfer was completed before Christmas. Nothing came through the phone for several seconds. I could hear only the faint static of the connection, and somewhere behind Dad, the muffled movement of people in his house. I imagined nothing beyond that. I did not know his expression. I did not know whether Mom was standing beside him or whether Colin had walked into the room. All I knew was that the man who had been speaking over me had stopped. When he finally answered, disbelief had replaced anger. He wanted to know why his mother would leave the family home to me without telling him. There was something in his voice I had not prepared for. Not greed, not yet. Injury. For Dad, the penthouse had never been just square footage. It was the place where his parents hosted everyone, then the place he had increasingly organized after Grandpa died. He had spent years behaving as though the future of it was obvious. I had spent years assuming the same thing. I told him I had not known either. That did not calm him. It gave him somewhere else to go. Dad asked how long I had really known. I repeated that I had learned only days earlier. He went quiet again, but this time the silence felt less like shock and more like resistance. He began circling back through the years when Grandma's living arrangements had divided us, reminding me how often I had challenged him when he tried to make plans for her. Then he asked the question that changed the entire shape of the conversation. Had I influenced Grandma? The words left a cold hollow beneath my ribs. I told him no. He pressed anyway, not with proof, but with the logic grief was already building for him. I had been the person who kept insisting Grandma should decide where she lived. I had opposed Dad when he wanted her moved sooner. I had spent years talking about choice and permission. Now the penthouse had been left to me. From where he stood, he said, the whole thing suddenly looked different, calculated. I ended the call before either of us said something we could not take back. A few minutes later, Colin messaged me separately. He wanted to know how long I had known and whether I really expected him to believe the timing was a coincidence. I did not answer him that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone dark beneath my palm and understood that changing the locks had been the easy part. Until that evening, the fight had been about Christmas. Now the inheritance had reached backward and touched every argument we had ever had about Grandma. In a matter of minutes, the same memories I had lived through were already beginning to acquire a new meaning inside my family. They had not stopped believing I was difficult. They were about to start believing I had been planning something all along. Christmas morning did not feel like Christmas. My phone was quieter than it had been the night before, but the silence was not peaceful. I had slept badly, waking more than once with Dad's questions still lodged in my mind. Had I influenced Grandma? I did not call the attorney on Christmas Day. There was no emergency, and I was not going to turn a holiday into one simply because my family had begun rewriting the past overnight. The first business morning after Christmas, I sat at my kitchen table with coffee going cold and asked only for facts I was entitled to know, not what Grandma had felt, not whether she had complained about Dad, and not some private explanation of her motives. The answer was narrow and clear. The beneficiary designation directing the penthouse to me had been executed roughly 18 months earlier as part of Grandma's established estate plan. I had not participated in the change. After she died, the successor trustee had followed the written terms already in place and completed the specific transfer. That was all the paperwork could prove, but the timing mattered. The change had been made well before Grandma's death, and after the worst arguments about how she should live. It pulled me back 4 years, to the period when concern for her had started changing shape inside our family. 4 years earlier, after Grandpa died, Dad had changed almost overnight. Not in a cruel way. That would have been easier to recognize. He became attentive. He called Grandma every morning. He started checking the weather before she went anywhere. He learned which pharmacy delivered fastest and which building staff member was on duty overnight. If she mentioned a light bulb out in a high fixture or groceries she had forgotten, Dad treated the problem as if it had been assigned directly to him. At first, I admired him for it. Grandpa George had always been the one who handled the small, practical things around the penthouse. He remembered service appointments, dealt with building notices, and knew which drawer held every warranty and instruction manual. After he died, the empty spaces he left were not only emotional, they were logistical. Dad stepped into many of them because he believed that was what a son was supposed to do. Colin and Tessa stepped in too. They both lived closer than I did, and their routines bent around Grandma more often than mine. Colin would drop off groceries on his way home, take her to appointments when schedules lined up, and answer calls when something in the apartment stopped working. Tessa checked in between work and whatever else she had planned, often staying longer than she intended, because Grandma had found one more story to tell before she left. My work took me out of the city in stretches. Not constantly, but often enough that I was not the person who received every late call. That difference mattered more than I understood at the time. For the first 2 years after Grandpa's death, Dad's concern mostly stayed inside the shape of help. Then Grandma became slower on stairs. Her eyesight worsened a little. She stopped liking to drive at night. None of it erased her independence, but each change made Dad more alert to what could go wrong. By 2023, the penthouse itself had begun to feel like evidence against her staying there. It was large. The building was busy. The elevators were reliable until they suddenly were not. During one particularly difficult stretch, a building problem left elevator service badly disrupted for several days. For most residents, it was an inconvenience. For Grandma, it changed how easily she could come and go and turned ordinary errands into something other people had to help manage. Dad responded the way he always did when fear entered a problem. He made a plan. By the time I understood how far he had gone, he had already researched senior communities near him. He had toured at least one without Grandma. He had started comparing services, transportation, meal plans, and availability. None of that was inherently wrong. The part that unsettled me was the way conversations around Grandma gradually stopped sounding like possibilities. They started sounding like decisions waiting for her cooperation. I remember one afternoon at the penthouse when Dad had spread brochures across the dining table. The same table where Grandma had served Christmas dinners for nearly 2 decades was covered with floor plans and pricing sheets. Colin stood beside him reading one of them. Mom thought the place Dad preferred looked comfortable. Tessa kept trying to identify a compromise everyone could live with. Grandma was sitting 3 feet away. People were discussing when she might move before anyone had asked whether she wanted to. I looked at her instead of the brochures. "What does Grandma want?" The room changed. Not dramatically. No one shouted. Dad's hand simply stopped moving for a moment. He said, we all knew what the situation was, and that waiting until something serious happened would be irresponsible. Colin agreed that the burden had already become difficult to manage. Mom reminded me that everyone was trying to keep Grandma safe. All of those things could be true. None of them answered my question. Grandma eventually did. She said she was not ready to leave. The words were quiet enough that everyone else's arguments suddenly seemed oversized. She knew the apartment was becoming harder. She knew people were helping her more. She knew there were risks. She was not pretending otherwise. She simply was not ready. I sided with her immediately. That was probably the moment Dad began hearing my questions differently. Before then, he could tell himself I was cautious. After that, every time I asked whether Grandma had agreed to something, he heard an accusation inside it. If he arranged a tour, I asked whether she wanted to go. If he talked about downsizing, I wanted to know whether she had decided what she wanted to keep. If he described a timetable, I wanted to know whose timetable it was. One evening, after Dad had made another argument about safety, Grandma put her hand flat against the table. "Ask me what I want before you decide what is good for me." Nobody answered immediately. I remember Dad looking toward the window rather than at her. At the time, I thought the sentence had settled the matter. It had not. It only clarified the sides. Colin became increasingly frustrated with me because the principle I was defending did not reduce the practical work. If Grandma chose to stay, someone still had to help when she needed something. Someone had to rearrange schedules. Someone had to take late calls. Someone had to get across town when the building created another problem. Very often, that someone was Colin. Tessa kept trying to soften everything. She would call me afterward and say Dad was worried, not controlling. Then she would call Dad and tell him I was protecting Grandma, not attacking him. She spent so much time translating everyone that none of us had to learn how to speak directly. Mom's solution was more familiar. She asked me to stop challenging Dad in front of Grandma because it only made things harder. I remember standing in my own kitchen during one of those calls, holding the phone too tightly. I thought Mom was asking me to choose comfort over Grandma's right to decide. What I did not hear was the exhaustion underneath the rest of the family. That was not the same as saying they were right. But it was something I had refused to separate at the time. The memory that came back most sharply was not one of Dad's arguments. It was Colin's. It had been late, after another difficult day connected to the building. He had missed part of an evening with his family because Grandma needed help. I was defending her decision to remain in the penthouse, and Colin finally stopped pretending he was only annoyed. It's easy to defend every choice when you're not the one rearranging your life around it. I had dismissed the sentence almost immediately. To me, it sounded like an argument for taking Grandma's choice away because caring for her was inconvenient. Sitting alone at my kitchen table 2 years later, I heard something different inside it. Not permission to control her. Exhaustion. For the first time, I wondered whether Colin had been trying to tell me something I was too busy being right to hear. Colin's old sentence stayed with me because I could finally hear the part I had rejected the first time. 2 years earlier, the elevator failure had lasted almost 4 days. Calling it an outage made it sound cleaner than it had been. One elevator returned to limited service for short stretches, then stopped again. Building staff were trying to manage deliveries and residents with mobility problems while contractors moved in and out of the lobby. Grandma could still walk, but stairs from her floor were not a reasonable option. Suddenly, groceries, appointments, medications, and even the simple question of whether she should leave the apartment became things someone else had to help coordinate. I had been in Philadelphia for work when it began, supervising the installation of a traveling exhibit that could not simply be abandoned halfway through. Colin handled the first emergency because he lived closest. He left work early, picked up groceries, brought them through the disrupted building, and stayed long enough to make sure Grandma had what she needed. The next afternoon, he had to rearrange another part of his schedule because she had an appointment that became much harder to manage with unreliable elevators. His wife adjusted around their children. Tessa shifted her own plans twice and spent one evening at the penthouse because Dad worried Grandma would need something overnight. I knew most of that at the time. Knowing it as a list was not the same as understanding what it felt like. I remembered Colin calling me from his car, his voice flattened by fatigue. He had already worked a full day and was trying to figure out whether he could make it home before his children went to bed. I had listened while checking email from a hotel room, surrounded by shipping schedules, lighting notes, and photographs of display cases waiting to be installed. I sympathized. I offered to come back as soon as my work allowed. Then I spent most of the conversation arguing about Dad. The elevator problem had frightened him enough that he immediately revived the senior community discussion. To Dad, the disruption was proof that the penthouse had become unsuitable for Grandma. By the time I returned to Boston, he had already begun talking as if the conclusion were obvious. I walked into the family conversation ready to defend her. Colin walked into it already exhausted, That difference had mattered. At the time, I heard every complaint about schedules, errands, and late calls as support for the same conclusion Dad wanted. Grandma needed to leave. I responded to the conclusion instead of the people making the complaints. When Colin said he could not keep dropping everything whenever the building or Grandma created another emergency, I argued that inconvenience could not become permission to take away her choice. The principal was still right. The way I listened was not. Sitting at my kitchen table that morning, I could see how quickly I had collapsed two different statements into one. Colin had been saying, "We cannot keep doing this alone." I had heard, "Grandma should no longer decide for herself." Those were not the same sentence. That realization did not make the secret Christmas chat hurt less. It did not make lying about the date acceptable. It did not turn Dad's pressure into wisdom. But for the first time, I could admit there had been a real burden underneath some of the resentment, and I had been too defensive to acknowledge it without fearing I was surrendering Grandma's autonomy. Later that day, Colin contacted me. He did not apologize for the wrong date message. He was nowhere near that yet. His anger had shifted from the locks to the inheritance, and he told me that from where he stood, the whole thing felt like a reward for someone who had carried less of the daily work while criticizing the people who carried more. I almost reacted the way I always had. There were a dozen defenses available to me. I had a demanding job. I had traveled because work required it, not because I wanted to leave everyone else with Grandma. I had helped when I could. Colin had chosen to live close to the penthouse. Dad had often created extra urgency because he treated every problem as evidence that Grandma should move. Every one of those statements contained some truth. I let them stay inside my head. What mattered more was the image of Colin sitting in his car 2 years earlier, trying to decide whether he would see his children before bedtime, while I explained why Dad was wrong. "I should have listened when you said you were exhausted," I told him. That still didn't give any of us the right to decide for her. The line left neither of us with an easy victory. Colin did not suddenly soften. He did not tell me I had finally understood him. He remained angry that Grandma's property had come to me and suspicious of what the timing meant. But his response changed in one small way. He stopped arguing as though I had denied his burden completely. He admitted that his anger at me had grown partly because every request for help had begun to feel like evidence I would later dismiss. We ended the conversation without resolution. For once, that did not feel like failure. Later that day, Tessa called long enough to confirm that adding me to the private thread had been an accident. She also admitted she had known the wrong date idea was wrong, but she still described her silence as an attempt to keep one Christmas calm. I was too tired to turn that call into either a fight or forgiveness. What stayed with me was the pattern. When confrontation frightened her, Tessa chose quiet first and dealt with the cost later. The conversation pulled another memory forward, this one from May of 2024. By then, the fight about Grandma's living arrangements had lasted long enough that everyone had settled into positions. Dad still believed moving was overdue. Colin was tired of being the closest emergency contact. Tessa continued searching for compromise. I remained determined that Grandma would not be pushed out simply because the rest of us found uncertainty difficult. Then one afternoon, Grandma changed everything by making the decision herself. I had gone to see her at the penthouse, expecting nothing more dramatic than coffee. She had already begun sorting through a few practical things, not packing exactly, but touching objects with the attention of someone thinking about what would matter in a smaller space. She told me she was ready. There was no crisis that day. No ambulance. No fall. No shouting match with Dad. She had simply reached the point where the apartment felt larger than the life she wanted to keep maintaining. She liked the senior community she had visited. She liked knowing meals and transportation would be easier. Most importantly, the decision no longer felt like someone else's deadline. I did not argue. I did not remind her how hard I had fought for her to remain. I helped her talk through what she wanted to take. That moment should have proved something to all of us. But by then, the family conflict had become too old to disappear, just because the original question had been answered. Dad treated the move as confirmation that his concerns had been right all along. Colin felt relieved. Tessa wanted everyone to stop revisiting the argument. I only cared that Grandma had chosen the timing herself. After she moved, I visited her one evening when the spring light was still lingering outside past dinner. Her new place was smaller, easier, and surprisingly cheerful. She had complained about the bland hallway carpet, but liked the windows. At some point, she thanked me for something I had not expected gratitude for. She said I had asked her what she wanted, when everyone, including people who loved her deeply, had become frightened enough to stop listening. She did not accuse Dad. She did not say Colin had failed her. She understood why they had been afraid. That was what made the observation stay with me. Love, in Grandma's view, did not automatically protect people from becoming controlling. Sometimes, fear simply made them more certain they were entitled to choose for someone else. At the time, I accepted Grandma's words as a private acknowledgement of a difficult period that was finally behind us. Now she was gone. The penthouse belonged to me, and the beneficiary change dated back to that same general period. I still did not know exactly why she had chosen me. For the first time, though, I wondered whether her decision had been about something larger than who should receive a piece of property. By then, the timing of Grandma's decision had begun to matter more than the property itself. She had changed the beneficiary roughly 18 months before her death, after the family conflict over her living arrangements had already unfolded, and without my involvement. That made Dad's theory of a last-minute scheme much harder to sustain. I could not know every private reason Grandma had for choosing me, and I refused to invent one. I only had what she had shown me while she was alive. The penthouse was meant to welcome people, and after she moved voluntarily, she had thanked me for asking what she wanted, instead of managing her through fear. Put beside the timing, the inheritance felt less like a reward than a responsibility to preserve welcome, without letting one person's certainty become everyone else's decision. Dad called again that evening. This time, there was less accusation in his voice, and more exhaustion. Christmas had passed, but the inheritance had not settled into something he could accept. He had clearly been thinking about it, perhaps sleeping as poorly as I had. What he finally said was more revealing than anything I could have guessed for him. To Dad, Grandma's decision meant his own mother had trusted me with the home he believed he had spent years protecting. He did not frame it as money. He did not ask for a percentage or threaten to contest anything. What injured him was the judgment he believed the choice contained. He had been the one who checked on her after Grandpa died. He had worried about the building, the stairs, the late calls, the future. He had believed he was doing what a responsible son should do, and now the house at the center of that responsibility had gone to the daughter who had challenged him most often. I could hear how personal it was. He said I had always had the luxury of asking what Grandma wanted, because I was not the one imagining the consequences if something went wrong. He reminded me that Colin and Tessa had rearranged their lives repeatedly. Dad had carried his own version of that burden too, even when his help came wrapped in pressure. For once, I let him finish. I could acknowledge the strongest version of his case now. Dad had been frightened, and Colin and Tessa had carried burdens I had not always seen clearly. None of that gave anyone the right to decide Grandma's answer for her, and none of it justified lying to me about Christmas. When Dad paused, I told him that distinction without trying to erase what he had carried. Dad went quiet at that. Then he returned to the same defense he had been using since Christmas Eve. He said the family had needed one calm night. He said every conversation involving Grandma had become an argument because I could not let anything go. He still spoke as though excluding me had been an unfortunate tool used in service of peace rather than a decision with its own cruelty. I stopped trying to make him agree with me. For most of my life, I had stayed inside family arguments too long because I believed the right wording would eventually make everyone understand. This time, I could hear where Dad's listening had ended. I told him the penthouse would remain mine, and that automatic access would not return. He did not threaten me or challenge the transfer. He did something quieter. He withdrew. Within days, I began hearing the new version indirectly. Dad told Mom, Colin, Tessa, and other relatives that the penthouse was mine now and I should be allowed to have it. He stopped discussing future gatherings there. He would not ask to use it, because asking itself seemed to him like accepting a version of the family he did not believe in. "It's Natalie's house now. Let her have it." The sentence made its way back to me through Tessa. It sounded generous until I understood what it meant. Dad was turning his refusal into a family position. If asking to use the penthouse meant accepting my boundary, then in his mind, the answer was for nobody to ask. At first, several relatives followed his lead simply because avoiding conflict was easier, and the home went unused. The silence grew slowly enough that I did not notice it on the first visit. I went there in early January to deal with ordinary ownership matters, and stayed longer than I meant to. The winter sun came through the windows at an angle that made the rooms look almost untouched. The kitchen was clean. The guest rooms were empty. The long dining table held nothing except the light from the windows. I had thought changing the locks would force my family to understand that access required permission. I had not expected them to answer by disappearing. For the first time since Grandma left me the penthouse, I stood in the middle of the place she had built around family and heard absolutely nothing. The home she trusted me to preserve had become empty. The emptiness lasted longer than I expected. At first, I treated it like a temporary reaction. Dad was angry, the others were embarrassed, and everyone had just spent the holidays watching one family conflict turn into another. I assumed someone would eventually ask whether the penthouse was available for a birthday, an overnight stay, a dinner downtown. For nearly 20 years, there had always been a reason for someone to use it. January passed without one. I still went there because ownership created ordinary responsibilities that did not care whether a family was speaking. I checked mail, met the building staff when something needed attention, made sure utilities and insurance were handled, and walked through rooms that had once seemed too full to hold everyone comfortably. The quiet was not dramatic. That was what made it difficult. Nothing was broken. No furniture had been overturned. There was no evidence of a family war except the absence of people who had once behaved as though the place could not function without them. The dining table bothered me most. Grandma had bought it because she hated separating people into different rooms during holidays. It was long enough for children to squeeze between adults and still leave space for platters in the middle. Now I would stand at one end of it while sunlight moved slowly across the wood and wonder whether keeping the penthouse made any sense if the family refused to enter it. For the first time, selling it stopped feeling unthinkable. The idea came quietly. A broker could handle the practical side. I could sell, invest the proceeds, and remove the physical center of a conflict. None of us seemed capable of separating from grief. I already had my own condo. I did not need a second home in Boston, especially one expensive enough that keeping it required real choices about money. Grandma had left me something valuable, but value did not make carrying costs disappear. Selling would solve a lot. No more arguments about keys. No more questions about who was entitled to host what. No more Dad telling people the penthouse had become a symbol of my control. No more walking through empty rooms, wondering whether I had preserved a family home or simply inherited a battlefield. I sat with the possibility for several days. What stopped me was not nostalgia. It was the memory of Grandma after she moved. She had not fought to remain in the penthouse forever. Once she was ready, she left it willingly. That had taught me something I had almost missed. Respecting a place did not mean refusing to change anything about it. But selling, because the rest of us had turned it into a weapon, felt different. It would let the conflict decide the future of the home as completely as Dad's old assumptions had. Before I made any decision, Tessa asked to see me. We met at the penthouse because she said she did not want to have the conversation through another screen. She arrived at the lobby without asking whether her old access had been restored. Instead, she called me and waited until I authorized her upstairs. That small detail did more to soften me than anything she could have said in the elevator. When she came through the door, She looked around as though the familiar rooms had become unfamiliar simply because she had entered them differently. She did not ask for her key back. She did not start with an explanation about Dad. She stood near the kitchen counter for a long moment before saying the sentence I had needed from her. I knew it was wrong, and I stayed in the chat anyway. She did not blame Dad or Colin, and she did not ask me to erase the week because she had finally named her part in it. I told her I appreciated the apology, but trust would have to return through behavior. When she left, she called from the lobby again rather than assuming she could come back whenever she wanted. When she left, she called from the lobby again rather than assuming she could return whenever she wanted. A few days later, Mom reached out. The difference was that she came alone. For years, almost every difficult conversation with her had been framed around Dad. She wanted me to understand his stress, his intentions, his temper, his grief. Even when she disagreed with him, she usually approached me as the person most likely to bend. This time, she did not ask me to be reasonable. She admitted something that sounded almost worse because of how ordinary it was. The family had gotten used to asking me to absorb the discomfort because I was the person least likely to explode. Dad became harder when challenged. Colin could get angry. Tessa withdrew. I usually went quiet, so people kept pushing the pain toward the person who made the least noise about it. Mom had spent years calling that peacekeeping. Sitting across from her in my condo, I could see how tired the habit had made her too. She had not invented Dad's behavior, but she had organized herself around it for so long that protecting the room from conflict had become more important than asking who kept paying for that protection. Being easier to hurt never made hurting me acceptable. That was all I said directly. Mom lowered her eyes. She did not argue. After that conversation, something subtle changed. She began contacting me without attaching Dad's opinion to every sentence. She did not tell me what he thought about the penthouse unless I asked. She stopped trying to carry his anger into rooms where he was not present. Colin took longer. When he finally contacted me, he did not apologize immediately. That would have been unlike him and, honestly, less believable than what happened instead. He admitted the wrong dateline had been his idea, and that part of him had wanted me to feel excluded because he had spent years believing his own exhaustion did not matter to me. I understood the motive without excusing the act. When I told him that, he said he knew. It was not a warm reconciliation, but it was the first time he had owned the cruelty without hiding it inside Dad's anger. By February, I stopped thinking about the penthouse as a problem I needed to eliminate. I decided not to sell. I also decided not to restore the old system. The decision came with one clear boundary. The penthouse would remain available for family gatherings, but no one would have permanent, unquestioned access. Relatives could request to use it, and I could invite them. I was not trying to make family life formal. I was ending the assumption that habit alone granted authority. Dad would hate the distinction, but I was beginning to believe a family home could survive a boundary better than it could survive entitlement. I did not know yet whether Dad would ever accept that, but I knew the first test of the new rule could not be another Christmas. Too much had already been attached to that night. I wanted something connected to Grandma without turning her memory into another argument. By the time winter began loosening its grip on Boston, I knew what the first gathering would be: her birthday. By the time spring reached Boston, I had stopped thinking about Grandma's birthday as a date I needed to survive. She would have turned 86. The idea of gathering at the penthouse came to me without ceremony. I did not want a memorial service. I did not want framed photographs arranged like evidence that we had all loved her correctly. Grandma would have hated the solemnity of that. What I wanted was simpler: food on the table, people telling the stories that made her laugh rather than the ones that made us look noble, and one evening in the place she had built around family. It would also be the first real test of the rules I had made after Christmas. That part frightened me more than I expected. Changing access had been easy because I had been responding to something already done to me. Hosting was different. Hosting meant choosing to open the door again. I sent the invitations individually. That was intentional. For most of my adult life, family plans had moved through one central current. Dad suggested something. Mom confirmed it, and the rest of us adjusted around the decision. Even when nobody meant harm, the family decided usually meant that enough people had stopped objecting. This time, no one was answering for anyone else. I sent Tessa the date and time and asked whether she wanted to come. I sent Mom her own invitation. I sent Colin one separately. I sent Dad one too. Every message contained the correct date. That detail was small enough to feel childish if I stared at it too long, so I did not turn it into a joke. I was not interested in reenacting Christmas from the opposite side. I simply gave everyone the information they needed and asked each person to decide for themselves. Tessa answered first. She said yes within an hour. Mom responded later that evening. Her message was brief, but one detail mattered. She wrote only for herself. No, your father and I. No explanation of what Dad thought. No suggestion that she needed to check whether attending would upset him. She was coming. Colin took almost 2 days. I expected either silence or a practical refusal, something about the children's schedule or work. Instead, he eventually accepted. He did not ask whether his old key worked. He did not mention access at all. Dad did not answer. For the first few days, I checked my phone more often than I wanted to admit. Every notification pulled my attention away from whatever I was doing, and each time I told myself I was only making sure I had not missed a work message. I was waiting for him. That habit was older than Christmas. Dad had always made silence feel like unfinished business. If he stopped answering after an argument, everyone else eventually found a reason to contact him. Mom would soften something. Tessa would try to reopen the conversation. I would begin wondering whether I had been too rigid. This time, I did not chase him. The invitation was there. So was the choice. A week before Grandma's birthday, Colin called with a practical question. His children had an early activity the following morning, and staying at the penthouse overnight would make the schedule easier than driving home late and coming back into the city. He asked whether that was okay. The question caught me so off guard that I walked to the window before answering. Below, traffic moved through an intersection slick with spring rain. For years, Colin had used the guest rooms whenever family events made it convenient. Nobody had asked Grandma every single time because she had encouraged the habit, and later the habit became something none of us examined. Now he was asking. I told him yes. There was a brief pause on the line. Neither of us pointed out what had just happened. We did not need to, he had asked. I had answered. Nothing had been taken from him by the exchange. That was the part I wished Dad could understand. The week of the gathering, Mom called me from her own phone and, for the first time, told me plainly what Dad had decided without turning his decision into a request. He was not coming. According to Mom, he believed the penthouse had become a place where everything happened according to my rules now. He thought attending would mean accepting that the family had to ask permission to use a home that had never worked that way before. Then he suggested Mom reconsider going too. The old version of her might have called me afterward and asked whether I could make an exception. She might have framed it as a way to avoid embarrassing Dad. She might have reminded me that Grandma's birthday was supposed to be about healing. Instead, Mom told him she had already accepted my invitation. She was going. Tessa made the same choice when Dad spoke to her. Colin did too. None of them declared independence in some dramatic family revolt. They simply answered for themselves. That was enough. For the first time I could remember, Dad's refusal remained Dad's refusal. It did not automatically become the family's position. The morning of Grandma's birthday, I arrived at the penthouse early. Spring had softened the city outside the windows. The trees far below carried the first real green of the season, and the light no longer had the hard winter edge I remembered from Christmas. I opened a few windows long enough to let fresh air move through the rooms, then closed them before the apartment became too cool. I kept the gathering simple. No memorial display, no formal seating plan, no speech waiting on the dining table. The rooms already held enough of Grandma without turning them into a museum of her life. The shape of the kitchen was hers. The way the afternoon light crossed the dining room was hers. The fact that I still knew which cabinet held the larger serving bowls was hers. I had spent enough years working in museums to know the difference between preserving something and freezing it. I wanted the penthouse alive. Tessa was supposed to arrive first, with Mom not far behind. Colin and his family would come later and stay overnight. About 25 minutes before the time I had given everyone, just as I finished arranging food in the kitchen, the building phone rang. The sound stopped me more completely than it should have. For 1 second, I assumed Tessa had arrived early. I answered. The concierge told me there was a guest downstairs asking to come up. Then he gave me the name, Douglas Whitmore. I did not move. Dad had received the same invitation as everyone else. He had ignored it. He had told Mom he would not attend. He had tried to persuade the others not to come, and now he was downstairs. The concierge did not describe his face or his mood. He did not tell me whether Dad was angry, embarrassed, or carrying anything. The building staff had no reason to turn this into a family drama. They had a man in the lobby with outstanding access, and an owner upstairs who could decide whether he entered. That was all. 4 months earlier, Dad would have walked through the building without a call reaching me. His access would have carried him upstairs before I even knew he had arrived. Now he was in the same position as every other guest. He had no key, no permanent permission, no certainty that being my father was enough. I stood beside Grandma's dining table with the phone against my ear, listening to the faint building system hum on the line. Then the concierge asked me the only question that mattered. Would you like me to send your father up? Yes, I said. Send him up. The answer did not feel like surrender. It felt like the opposite. 4 months earlier, Dad had expected the penthouse to open for him, because it always had. Now I was choosing to let him enter, knowing I could have said no, and knowing he understood that too. I put the building phone down and stood in the kitchen while the elevator made its slow climb. My hands were steady, but I became aware of small things I had not noticed a minute earlier. The refrigerator motor, the faint smell of coffee, the soft scrape of a tree branch against one of the windows. I had imagined conversations with Dad dozens of times since Christmas. None of those imagined versions mattered now. When the elevator doors opened outside the unit, I heard his footsteps before the knock. That alone felt unfamiliar. Dad had not knocked at that door in years. I opened it. He looked older than he had at Christmas. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, perhaps, but grief had settled into the lines around his mouth. He wore the same dark coat he usually wore through Boston winters and early spring, though the day was warm enough that he had left it unbuttoned. He stepped inside only after I moved aside. There was no hug. He glanced toward the dining room, where I had already set out glasses and plates for Grandma's birthday gathering. His eyes moved over the room slowly. Whatever memories crossed his mind belonged to him. I did not try to narrate them for him. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Dad told me why he had come. Christmas, he said, had not started as some scheme to punish me. In his mind, it had started as an attempt to get through one holiday without returning to the same fight about Grandma. Her death had left every old disagreement exposed again, and he believed my presence would turn the evening into another judgment on everything he had done during her final years. He had wanted proof that the family could still be together without reopening that question. The logic sounded worse when spoken months later. Dad seemed to know that, although he still resisted naming the larger problem. He did not say he had been controlling. He did not say Grandma had been right and he had been wrong. He spoke instead about pressure, responsibility, fear. He had spent years imagining the phone call that would tell him something had happened to his mother while she was alone. Every elevator failure, every missed appointment, every difficult day in that enormous apartment had felt like evidence that waiting carried a cost. And whenever he tried to act, I had challenged him. He said that after enough years, my presence itself began to feel like accusation. That was why he had wanted Christmas without me. Not because he believed I was no longer his daughter, he insisted, but because he wanted one night when he did not have to feel like the entire family was silently deciding whether he had failed his mother. I listened until he had finished. The old version of me would have started correcting details halfway through. I would have reminded him that Grandma eventually moved voluntarily, that I had never opposed senior living itself, that concern did not justify arranging someone else's life. Those things were still true. But I had learned enough since Christmas to know that listening to his fear did not require accepting what he did with it. "You were allowed to be afraid," I said. "You were allowed to think Grandma was making the wrong choice." Dad's jaw tightened slightly. I continued before the conversation could turn into another argument about whether his fears had been reasonable. "You weren't allowed to decide her answer before she gave it. And you weren't allowed to erase me from Christmas because I refused to agree with you." The words hung between us without needing decoration. Dad looked away. For once, I did not fill the silence. As the scheduled gathering time approached, the first knock came from the hallway. Tessa arrived, visibly surprised to find Dad there. Mom followed, then Colin, while his wife and children were still on their way. Their timing was ordinary. What changed was what happened after they entered. Dad had spent years speaking as if one family position existed once he stated it firmly enough. This time, Mom, Tessa, and Colin did not let him gather their voices into his. Mom acknowledged her own part in protecting peace at my expense. Tessa did not repeat her whole apology. She simply made it clear that Dad could speak for himself, not for her. Colin still stood by the fact that his exhaustion had been real, but he owned the wrong date message as his cruelty, not as something the family had forced him to write. Dad looked from one of them to the next. There was no dramatic revolt, and no unanimous verdict against him. There was simply no single family opinion for him to claim anymore. That was when I stated the future of the penthouse as simply as I could. The home would remain available for family gatherings, but the old system was over. No permanent, unquestioned access. No scheduling events there before asking, and no using the home to decide who counted as family. Colin and Tessa accepted the boundary as practical rather than punitive. Dad did not. To him, the change still felt like proof that the family home had become mine in a way that separated it from everyone else. I could see that he was not ready to understand the distinction Grandma had spent years trying to make. Asking permission did not destroy belonging. It prevented belonging from becoming entitlement. I stopped expecting him to understand it that afternoon. What he did give me was smaller. He admitted that giving me the wrong date had been cruel. He said Christmas should never have been used to punish me for the fight about Grandma. That mattered. It was not everything. He still defended most of the choices he had made for Grandma as the actions of a responsible son. He still believed I underestimated what would have happened if something had gone wrong. He was not ready to call his behavior control. I did not turn partial accountability into full reconciliation, just because I wanted the day to end neatly. His key was not returned. Eventually, Dad looked toward the dining room again. The plates were waiting. Grandma's birthday gathering had not even begun yet, but the room had already changed in a way she probably would have understood better than any of us. Dad said he was not staying. He could not sit through a family gathering under rules he still believed were wrong. I did not argue. He picked up his coat, walked to the door, and paused with his hand near the frame, as though habit expected something from the old lock that was no longer there. Then he left. No one followed him. Mom stood very still for a few seconds, but she did not gather her things. Tessa remained beside the kitchen counter. Colin exhaled slowly and went to check what time his wife and children would arrive. The day did not collapse, because Dad had chosen not to participate. That might have been the most important thing any of us learned. A few minutes later, I brought the food to the table. We did not give speeches about Grandma. We ate. We remembered the ridiculous way she used to overestimate how much dessert a family needed. Tessa told a story that made Mom laugh harder than I had heard since November. When Colin's children arrived, the apartment became noisy again. Dad had not changed enough to stay. But the rest of us had finally proved something he had spent years refusing to imagine. The family could gather, make choices, remember Grandma, and keep going without his decision automatically becoming everyone else's rule. By early summer, The penthouse no longer felt empty, but it did not feel repaired either. That distinction mattered. Several weeks had passed since Grandma's birthday. Dad and I spoke rarely, and when we did, our conversations stayed on safe ground. He had admitted that excluding me from Christmas and deliberately giving me the wrong date had been cruel. He had not gone further. He still believed most of what he had done during Grandma's final years had been necessary, and I no longer tried to force a larger admission out of him before he was capable of making one. The distance between us remained. What changed first were smaller things. Tessa stopped using Mom as a relay whenever plans shifted. If she wanted to know whether I was available, she asked me. If she needed something, she called directly, instead of first trying to determine what Dad thought would create the least conflict. None of those exchanges were dramatic enough to become stories on their own, which was probably why I trusted them more. Mom changed too. For years, difficult conversations with her had often ended with some version of the same request. Could I be the bigger person? Could I let something go? Could I understand that Dad was under pressure? That phrase disappeared. She still loved him. She still lived with him. She had not turned against her husband because of me, and I did not want her to. What changed was simpler. She stopped treating his discomfort as a responsibility that automatically belonged to everyone else. Colin's progress was slower and almost entirely practical. One afternoon he contacted me because relatives might be coming into Boston later in the year, and he wanted to know whether the penthouse could possibly be available for them. He did not tell me what dates had already been decided. He did not assume the guest rooms were open because they usually had been. He asked whether I would consider it. I checked my schedule before answering. That tiny pause would once have seemed absurd in a family where access had operated mostly through habit. Now it felt normal. There was no argument when I told him we could work out the dates closer to the visit. By then, I had begun thinking about using the penthouse again for something deliberately ordinary. Not another memorial. Not another symbolic family test. Not Christmas. I invited everyone I wanted there for a simple early summer lunch. Tessa came, Mom came. Colin and his family were invited. His wife planned to arrive before him because Colin had to handle a small scheduling problem with the children first. There was no formal purpose beyond eating together in a place that had spent too long carrying the weight of every unresolved argument we had. I did not invite Dad. That decision was harder than I expected. For several days, I considered sending him the invitation simply because not doing so looked too much like Christmas in reverse. That resemblance bothered me enough that I examined the difference carefully. Dad had excluded me to punish disagreement and then lied so he could use a home he assumed would open for him anyway. I was not trying to punish him. I was acknowledging where our relationship actually stood. He had come to Grandma's birthday. He had admitted one specific wrong. Then he had left because he still rejected the boundaries under which the penthouse now operated. In the weeks afterward, he had done nothing that suggested he wanted to build something different with me. An invitation was not an obligation I owed simply because we shared blood, so I did not send one. I also did not ask Mom, Tessa, or Colin to choose between us. They could see Dad whenever they wanted. They did not have to agree with my decision in order to come to lunch. The day itself was almost disappointingly normal. That was exactly what I wanted. Tessa arrived carrying food she had clearly bought instead of pretending she had cooked. Mom corrected her about how much should go in the refrigerator, then caught herself halfway through and laughed. Colin's wife arrived ahead of him and helped me set out plates while we waited for the others. Nobody discussed Christmas, nobody discussed inheritance, nobody asked whether Dad should have been there. For a while, the loudest sounds in the apartment were cabinet doors, dishes touching the counter, and Tessa complaining that Grandma had somehow owned 3 serving bowls, almost identical in size, and still insisted each one had a different purpose. The penthouse had changed without becoming unrecognizable. That pleased me more than I had expected. I had worried that boundaries would make the place formal, that everyone would begin acting like guests in a museum, afraid to touch anything without written permission. Instead, once the first awkwardness passed, people moved through the kitchen naturally. Mom knew where things belonged. Tessa opened the wrong cabinet twice. Colin's wife put drinks in the refrigerator without asking me where every bottle should go. Respect did not require ceremony. It required knowing there was another person on the other side of the decision. My phone buzzed shortly before we planned to eat. Colin was running late. One of the children's earlier activities had gone longer than expected, and he was bringing both kids with him now. His wife read the message over my shoulder and shook her head with the tired amusement of someone who had experienced the same scheduling problem 100 times. Years earlier, that kind of inconvenience might have turned into another story about Colin caring more than the rest of us. That afternoon, it was simply life. We waited. The children arrived loudly enough to announce themselves before I even reached the front hall, but they did not come through the door. The bell rang. I stopped for half a second. Colin still knew the penthouse better than most people ever would. For years, he had carried a permanent key. He had entered with groceries, Christmas presents, children, overnight bags, and whatever Grandma had called him to fix. There had been a time when ringing the bell would have seemed almost ridiculous. Now I could hear the children on the other side of the door, impatient and talking over each other. Colin did not try the handle. He did not call to tell me he was outside. He simply waited. I walked toward the door. There had been months when I thought the story was about locks, then about the penthouse, then about proving Dad wrong. By summer, I no longer needed any of those explanations to be complete. Colin had been genuinely overburdened. Tessa had avoided conflict until avoidance became complicity. Mom had protected Dad's discomfort by asking quieter people to absorb it. Dad had loved his mother and still let fear harden into certainty. I had defended Grandma's autonomy, while sometimes failing to hear the cost others were carrying. None of those truths made the Christmas deception acceptable. I no longer needed a clean villain or a perfect victim in order to trust my own boundary. Keeping the penthouse was a real choice with financial and emotional costs, and I was making it with open eyes. I reached for the door and opened it. Colin stood there with his children, slightly out of breath from whatever delay had followed them across the city. One child moved forward before he did, already talking about being hungry. Colin stepped aside to let them enter, then followed only after I had opened the door wide enough. There was no apology attached to the moment, no speech. No one mentioned his old key. Mom called from the dining room that the food was getting cold, and the children hurried toward her. Colin closed the door behind him and carried what he had brought into the kitchen. Within minutes, the apartment was noisy again. Grandma had spent years teaching us that a family home was a place people could come back to. I finally understood the part we had missed. Coming back still meant asking the person inside to open the door.